Andrew, for having us, and thanks to y'all for bringing us in this week. So I'll start with a little bit of an introduction about sort of how this research came to be and how Neil and I got connected and sort of our process of starting to gather everything. And then Neil will go through and walk us through our findings. So thank y'all again. My name is Jay Jenkins. I'm an attorney with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, and I'm based here in Harris County. So jumping right in, I started with TCJC in 2014, and part of my work was a grant to support the Public Defender's Office, which was relatively new at the time. But that was something I didn't know until I got down here. And so when I got down here and started talking to the public defender, you know, the PD's office has great attorneys, but it's very small here. And I had never really experienced an assigned counsel system, especially not one in a jurisdiction as big as Houston. And so it really sort of got me curious. And just hearing from the public defenders that were in some of these courts all the time, talking about some of the lawyers whose names y'all probably know that are appointed in Harris County and plead their clients out very quickly and are favorites of some of the judges. And so around that time too, the Texas Indigent Defense Commission started, or they may have started earlier, but that was when I started finding the Texas Indigent Defense Commission data on appointments from each court, and really started looking into why these folks were being appointed or just trying to explain or see what was happening. And from there, it really was interesting because I dug into a little bit of the campaign finance records, just did some spot checking, and what I found was these same attorneys that were receiving a lot of these appointments seemed to be donating to judges, at least the ones I was spot checking, and many of them were writing defense attorney in the box on the campaign donation. And so it didn't seem like anybody was really ashamed of it when I started asking around, the reaction I got was one of sort of resistance to really even engaging on that topic. And so around the same time, I started advising on a group project at Georgetown Law School for a class that was unrelated to Neil, called Law and Technology. And for that class, I was advising a group of students on a project actually looking at the results. Tony Fabello has just recently released an updated great news study of the Harris County Public Defender's Office, but the students I was working with were looking into the efficacy of the PD's office versus the appointed lawyers. And they found that their results were that the PD's office was more effective, but we couldn't really suss a lot of that out. They weren't PhDs. They didn't have a lot of statistical expertise. And so I went actually to DC for the final presentation of the students' research project. And there were a number of other student groups that presented that had their own individual advisors. And one of the other group's advisors, I think, was a law school classmate of Neil. And so after everybody presented, we all went out to grab a beer, and this other advisor said, let me stop by Neil's office to see if he's around. I'd love to include him when we go get a beer. So Neil was in his office, and when we went to the bar, I started telling Neil about all this information that I had, and then I had sort of confirmed a little bit some of the attorneys that I knew, but there was so much data out there that I had no knowledge about collecting, about cleaning, about really synthesizing the data in a way that we could start to make some of these conclusions. And Neil was really interested, and so we talked, I think that was in December of 2017, and then we started talking, I think, January, February that in 2018, and then we're working, we're harassing Clay Bowman in the Office of Court Administration in Harris County for data for a good while. But we're ultimately able to get the data, and then Neil was really able to do, you know, to figure out the best way to synthesize it and combine it, and it all sort of came together and into this final product. And so we're excited to, you know, we're excited with what we found. The findings sort of confirmed what we were seeing on the ground. And then I think they're also sort of a little bit even beyond what I could have thought we could do with the data. And so I'll pass it off to Neil, and he can start digging into some of the numbers we got. But yeah, that was sort of the origin story of our research here, was that and it's been a really cool sort of combination of me being on the ground and talking to people in court, and Neil really being able to take the data that we have and do sort of amazing things with it. So Neil, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Jay, and thank you, Andrew, for inviting us here. It's always a pleasure, you know, to hear how our partnership started here, because it reminds me that, you know, someday again when we get to go out and have a beer again, that good things can happen over a beer. So it's great that we met and that we started this project a couple of years ago. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through kind of the analysis. I have slides here, so I'm going to share my screen first of all, and hopefully if you could give me some indication that you're seeing the screen properly. Anyone? Just, yep, you guys can see it? Okay.
Great.
All right, great. All right. So, you know, I understand this crowd understands about indigent defense and the right to counsel, so I don't have to spell this out too much here, but obviously there's a right to counsel under the U.S. Constitution for state felony defendants since Gideon and, you know, their previous cases obviously too. And I probably don't have to tell you that there's been a lot of disappointment about this, right? That the right to counsel has kind of not really lived up to expectations in a lot of jurisdictions. And largely this is because the conventional view is that these institutions that take care of indigent defense are unfunded. And that's certainly true in a lot of situations. And a lot of folks have talked about, well, you know, the fact that, you know, part of the problem here is a lack of political will to help these folks out. It's difficult to show ineffective assistance under Strickland. There's an increase in prosecutorial power, which makes it hard to, you know, meaningfully take care of or defend indigent defendants. And there are different societal critiques, right? I mean, that the system is actually designed to make poor people lose. So one of my colleagues at Georgetown, Paul Butler, has written about this. But what we really wanted to focus on was that another problem is maybe even in some sense more mundane. It's kind of right out there, but folks maybe don't think about this, is that there's this incentive gap between how what defense attorneys want and what defendants want, right? Ideally, defense attorneys' incentives would be aligned with their clients, right? That's what we expect. But here, it turns out there are these incentive gaps. So first, let's think about assigned counsel system, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, right? Where these are attorneys, private attorneys, who are appointed by a court to represent indigent defendants, right? You can see that there could be distortions in the incentives of counsel depending on how they're paid. So for example, if they're paid by the case, the distortion's kind of apparent on its face, right? What's the incentive for you if you're paid by the case? Well, the incentive is to try and get as many cases as possible and to go through them as quickly as possible, which you can sort of see on its face that's probably not aligning with the incentives of individual criminal defendants, okay? And so we go through this in our article, which is which if you're interested, I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's on SSRN. It's linked to in the New York Times piece that sort of accurately summarizes our piece. So I encourage you all this, which we're going to be showing, the slides and all of that, all that's in the actual the graphs from the slides are in the actual paper. Okay, and similarly, assigned counsel have this sort of incentive to potentially to maximize the amount of caseload and minimize the effort on each case. Okay, and so, you know, contract attorneys face some similar incentives, and public defenders you might think public defenders don't have this kind of incentive, but they have different incentives that are not necessarily aligned with indigent defendants either, right? If they're overwhelmed by the caseload, if you don't properly fund a public defendant's office, then they're going to have to triage. They're going to have to figure out which cases do I spend time on, which cases do I essentially just try and get them to plead out, right? And to the extent that we're worried about things like implicit bias, that's going to be a problem, right? It'd be a problem if public defenders are encouraging, for example, Black and brown defendants to plea out at disparate rates as compared to white defendants, right? I think we'd be troubled by that. So, right, this incentive gap is really underlying a lot of the problems in indigent defense, okay? And so what we focus on in this paper is one aspect of this. Does campaign finance worsen the incentive gap? And so our research is really the first research that looks at how campaign finance might affect trial court decision-making. Folks have previously looked at state Supreme Courts, including in Texas, and they've said, well, okay, look at like a justice of the Texas Supreme Court, and they have a pro-business decision, and they receive donations from businesses, right? Let's say the donations from business and they're pro-business. Or on their side, justice receives donations from unions and their rulings are pro-union. Okay, there have been studies like that. The problem with those kind of studies is that it's not clear whether the donation is actually leading to the behavior or if like the donor and the justice just have similar preferences. So for example, if I'm pro-business and a business might want to support my campaign, but that doesn't mean just because they paid for my campaign, that's the reason why I'm subsequently voting in a pro-business fashion when I get on the court. It could be that we just both agree that we're pro-business, right? So it's not really showing like what we would say like a pay-to-play or a corruption due to campaign finance. And it's also focused on appellate courts, not on trial courts, okay? So it's hard to actually show a quid pro quo, like the word of the earlier this year, I guess, or last year. It's hard to show that in this context, okay? And so what we focus on actually is we do actually, I think, show that clearly that's going on at the trial court level. And we focus on Texas, on Harris County, but our paper also has anecdotes from Oklahoma and Michigan. And any place where you have a system where elected judges have an ability to kind of control who gets appointed in assigned counsel systems, and I'll go into detail about what we're showing here, you might have this potential for pay-to-play that we're going to be talking about, right? And these are all the different states where this might be going on, okay? So again, the key question here is, do judges and attorneys engage in pay-to-play, right? And the idea here is that assigned counsel give donations to judges, and those judges in turn preferentially appoint their donors to indigent defense cases. And the reason, incentive here is, right, the judges want to get funded because they want to get elected, and the attorneys want to get paid. And so the idea here is this pay-to-play actually going on, and how can we show that, right? And also, of course, really important question is, does this adversely affect criminal defendants, right? Some people might say, oh, there's pay-to-play, but that's just how we do things, and really, it actually benefits the criminal defendant, right? Can we show that this is likely not true, okay? If there are any questions, you should feel free to chime in. I should have specified that earlier, but just to clarify stuff, I'm totally open to that. So just chime in and let me know. Okay, and then if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about policy responses to address this conduct. Okay, so first of all, this is obviously a map of Texas, and it shows different kinds of indigent defense that exist across the state, right? Blue means assigned counsel exists there. Green means that there is a public defender, though that's a bit misleading, right? You see Harris County. I think you can see my arrow right here, right? Okay, you can see this right here is Harris County in green. So they do have a public defender, but in our sample, that public defender only handles about 3% of all indigent defense cases. So it's misleading to kind of suggest that they really have a public defender. It largely is assigned counsel. But you can see there's a lot of assigned counsel going on in Texas, okay? And I don't need to tell you about Harris County. It's a big place. It's a very populous county. As I mentioned, they have recently opened a public defender's office. And they have something called the wheel system of assignment. Again, you might be very familiar with this, but the idea is that you're supposed to rotate across eligible attorneys on a wheel. So it's kind of supposed to be a random assignment system. and in order to get on that wheel, there's certain requirements, right? You have to be licensed, you have to practice for a certain number of years, and there are different requirements depending on what kind of trial you're going to be involved in, right? The more serious the felony, obviously, the more experience you need. Okay, so we got data, right, as Jay suggested from Clay Bowman, right, that suggests that, okay, when are people actually appointed to the wheel? Okay, when are attorneys actually added to the wheel? So we collected all of this data, right? So green, for example, means that they were on the wheel for at least part of that year. The yellow means that they applied, et cetera. So we collected all of this detailed data on individuals and when they actually were added to the wheel in Harris County, okay? And we also have detailed information on payments, right? Now, this is actually at the case level. We actually have data at the annual level. We're trying to get more granular data at the case level. But this gives you an example of how an attorney might get paid. So this attorney showed up in this case for 5 court days, right? That's the 5 right there, you can see, and received $125 a day. So you end up with a total of $625, right? And they submit this, they list the days, and so that's how the attorney got paid for this case, okay? So, okay, and this is actually just an anecdote to tell you, you know, what we're gonna show you with data. It's always useful when you're doing an empirical project to have sort of qualitative evidence too. So I should have maybe told you this at the beginning. My background is I'm an attorney. You know, I've practiced previously and I clerked, and my first job actually way back when, even before actually going to law school, was volunteering at the public defender's office in Cook County, Chicago. So I'm very interested in these issues to begin with. After I did all of that, I went back to school and did my PhD in economics. So that gave me the sort of the tools needed to be able to do the kind of data analysis that we're going to do here. But you know, the quantitative stuff is great, but it wouldn't make much sense if we didn't have good stories that sort of suggested what was going on here in the first place. So for example, this is an attorney who operates in Houston, Galveston. He told us, you know, he was working for another attorney at the time, and he said like he'd have to start charging some monthly fee out of our hourly pay to donate to judges' campaign funds. He said these donations were necessary to keep his lights on and keep allowing us to pay him. And then he tells us, you know, after I left his office, I know that pay to play continued because that attorney later told me in passing that the election of new judges meant that he had, quote, lost some courts, okay? So there's a lot of smoke in terms of what was going on here, but no one had really quantified it and sort of tried to rigorously show that pay to play is actually going on, right? So how did we do this? So you'll see right here, there's a lot of white space here because there are a lot of data sets that had to be merged together. Okay, first we have to find out all this data on criminal cases, right? Cases and courts and attorneys and what happens in those cases. So we have this core data set from Harris County, okay? Then we have to merge in actually the names of the judges because the judges are actually omitted from there. And to do that, we use data from the Texas Secretary of State, right, which gives us names on candidate names and court and election year. And we merge. When you see the arrow, this shows the variables on which we merged, right? So we merge based on the court and the year, okay? We then collected information with the Texas Ethics Commission on campaign contributions. And this is essentially tells you who the donor and donees are. Now, this turns out to be very complicated to merge because the names are not cleanly stated in all of these data sets. So, in one data set, the guy's name might be Rob Smith, and another data set it might be Robert Smith, right? Or it might be misspelled, or it might be a maiden name, with something you have to deal with. How do you figure out if someone changes their name? What if they don't? What if they donate under the name of their employer, not under their own particular name, like for example, a law firm? So we had to go through all of these complications and use something called the fuzzy matching techniques to be able to deal with them. So this was pretty complicated to be able to just connect donations to courts. But over the course of time, with the help of, I worked on this, and one of my research assistants, Arturo Romero, who's an excellent PhD student in economics at Georgetown, he helped to do this. We kind of put all this together over time, okay? So that's data set number 3 right here, the second one I merged in, okay? Okay, then we have to actually figure out what the revenues are that attorneys receive. So this is information that the Texas Indigent Defense Commission has collected. And this is essentially information on how much attorneys have earned per fiscal year per court, okay? And so what we want to do here is be able to merge that in that'll give us a sense of how much an attorney earned from a particular judge. And this data is actually only available from 2014, right? The other data is all the way from 2005. So this is a bit of more of a limited window of what we have here, but you'll see that tells us enough, right? And you know, in order to merge this in, we have to figure out what the bar number is of the attorney, which turned out to be complicated because we have to convert this SPN number in Harris County into a bar number, but we did all of that, okay? Then data set number 5 is actually bar data from the Texas State Bar. So this is information about where these attorneys went to law school, when they were admitted, whether there's disciplinary information, how long they practiced. This is useful because it gives us a sense of who these attorneys are, right? One of the arguments you might be thinking is perhaps these donor attorneys are just really good attorneys and are really better. Is this something we can see in the data? And as I'll show you, the answer to that is no, they're not particularly better. There's no real reason to believe that these are like superstar attorneys, and it's a good thing that they're getting disproportionately appointed to cases. Okay, and then finally we merged in obviously the wheel data that I showed you earlier, right, based on the attorney name. So you can see now there's a whole constellation of data sets across hundreds of thousands of observations that we have to merge in and collect and clean over time to get all of our data together. Okay, so once we've done all of this work, what do we see? So I'm going to show you some tables of summary statistics, and then I'm going to show you some graphs, which I think the graphs really tell the tale. Okay, so first some summary statistics. So we have about 330,000 cases, right? You can see that up here, spread across about 770 attorneys. Okay, and some of them, about 69 of these attorneys are public defenders. The rest are private attorneys. And this is all across the 22 criminal courts in Harris County. There are a number of different judges because some of them get elected or retire or lose election or whatever, across 8 general elections, right? And so we can see that the actual amount of donation, the total amount of donation here is actually across all judges that we see is not that much, like $630,000, right? Which doesn't seem like all that much money, which makes what we find even more striking. This is not even like high level corruption that we're spotting. This is kind of like low level corruption. It's like surprisingly cheap to buy a case, as we show here. And you can see, for example, the mean donation is about $338. The median donation here is about $250. So these are pretty small donations, but they seem to have an effect, okay? Okay, so this is the first thing you should take a look here is this is showing you the difference between donors. This column shows you donors, and this column shows you non-donors. So what do I mean by donor? A donor means that an individual donated to attorney donated to at least one judge in our data set, okay? So what does this mean? This means that in our sample, about 26% of attorneys donated to at least one judge during the time period we're looking at, and about 3/4 did not. So 1/4 are donors, 3/4 are not. Now, we might wonder, are these donors being assigned really different cases than the non-donors? And so you can just compare these numbers in these 2 columns, right? So proportion of first-degree felonies, second-degree felonies, et cetera, right? And if you take a look at these numbers, they're all pretty close, right? This is 16%, 7, almost 7, 51, 52, et cetera. They're all pretty close, right? The defendants that they get, you know, non-donors might be getting slightly more non-white defendants, but it's pretty close, right? Average age is about the same. And this is, again, the information about these, you know, where these individuals went to law school. So, for example, the donor attorneys went to law school that's on average ranked like 108, whereas the non-donors went to ones that are 118. It's fairly close, all of this stuff. The number of years since admission, also fairly close. So the thing to take away from this is that donors and non-donors are kind of similar in terms of the types of cases they're assigned and their sort of background characteristics. Okay? Now, how does that compare with the number of cases that they're assigned? So that's this table. So this is the number of cases appointed and revenue. So again, if you look at this top line again, you see about 26% of attorneys were donors. If you look at the line right below that, though, you'll see what proportion of cases did they get. Well, 26% of attorneys got about 53% of cases. So if you expected that they were being appointed in proportion to like the number of attorneys that they are, you'd expect this to be about near 26% too, but it's double that. So just on its face, you can kind of see right here that donors are getting about twice as many cases as non-donors without doing any real fancy analysis. you can kind of see that, okay? And that should give you some pause. Like the donors look very similar to non-donors as we showed in table 2 in terms of their background, but they're getting twice as many cases, okay? And if you look in terms of the amount of revenue per attorney-judge pair, by attorney-judge pair, I mean like take all the attorneys in the sample, take all the judges in the sample, and a pairing is like matching attorney A to judge 1, right? Or attorney A to judge 2, right? Any sort of situation in which that attorney was appointed a case in that court. If that is a donor pairing, in other words, that attorney donated to that judge at some point, that attorney on average earned about $31,000 from cases from that judge. If on the other hand, there's no donation, they earned about $13,000, okay? So again, it's over double. So again, this is consistent with the story in which donor attorneys are earning a lot more money and getting assigned a lot more cases, right? And we can see this graphically. So if we compare, so this is graphic, so I should show you what this graph says. This x-axis is basically the number of cases. It's technically the natural log of the number of cases. You use the natural log because it just visually becomes easier to show, but I could show the total number of cases. It's the same idea, okay? This is a histogram. So if you remember from statistics, right, a histogram essentially shows like the frequency of various observations. So as you go off to the right here, that means more cases, okay? So more cases as you go off to the right and fewer cases as you go to the left. Okay, the white boxes represent donors. The gray boxes represent non-donors. So what can you see from here? You can immediately see that the distribution of donors is shifted to the right. Okay, so what does that mean? That means on average, donors are receiving more cases than non-donors, right? It's apparent in this graph on its own right here, right? The distribution of donors is to the right, okay? So this is comparing donors to non-donors. But again, you could say, well, okay, but maybe that's because these donors are just better attorneys. That's why they're getting more cases. So what we can do instead is now limit our sample just to attorneys who donated to one judge, okay? At least one judge in our sample. So we're gonna only look at donor attorneys, and we're gonna ask, these donor attorneys, where are they getting their cases? Are they getting their cases from the judge to whom they donated? Or are they getting cases from other judges to whom they did not donate? Because if the idea is that they're somehow better attorneys because they're donors, maybe they're donors, that means they're rich, that means they were really successful attorneys, and that's why, you know, they deserve more cases. Well, if that's true, then you'd expect them to get more cases, not just from the judges they happen to donate to, but to other judges, from other judges as well, right? But it turns out when you do this analysis, you get the same picture right here. So again, the white here are donors to the appointing judge. Gray means that they're a donor to another judge. So in other words, donors are getting more cases basically only from the attorneys, basically only from the judges to whom they donated. So if I'm a donor attorney, then I'm getting a donation, I'm getting additional cases only from that judge to whom I donated and not other judges I might appear before, right? But I didn't donate to them. So I think this is pretty strong evidence that what's going on here is pay to play, okay? And I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, all right? And you could do the same sort of graphs with revenues. This is the same idea, but just looking at revenue. So now the x-axis is not cases or log cases, it's log revenue. And you can again see the white boxes are shifted to the right, okay? And you can then do as a regression analysis. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I don't want to take up the discussion, but what a regression analysis essentially tells you, so for these first 3 columns, this is the total number of cases that are appointed, and this is the total that's donated. So what this is telling you, the stars mean that this is statistically significant, okay? What this is saying in column 1 is that for every dollar I donate, I get 0.7 more cases assigned to me. So it's like, what, $13 basically to buy a case, right? This column 4 is saying, for every dollar that I donate, I earn about $28 in revenue, right? So if you think of it as like a return on investment, it's like a 28x return on investment. Now, it's interesting, it's usually do the comparison. If, for example, you had invested in the S&P 500, right, $1,000 at the trough, at the bottom of the, when the stock market was at its bottom in the Great Recession, right, in 2008, okay, and then waited 10 years, your investment would have gone up 5x, okay? These attorneys are making a 28x return on investment. And remember, this is underestimated, if anything, because the revenues we only have for 4 or 5 years, okay? Whereas the cases we have for a longer period of time. So they're making wildly, like much more money from, the donation is benefiting them much more than you could get if you kind of invested a comparable amount in the stock market, right? Roughly speaking, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, here's another piece of evidence that what's going on is pay to play. So what this is showing is the date on which an individual first donated, right, to a judge versus the date on which they came onto the wheel, okay? So the idea here is there really should be no correlation. If pay to play is not going on, there should be no correlation between those two, okay? When I donate should not really be related to when I become eligible for appointments because they're not related. But what we show is when you take the first donation date and you subtract the case assignment eligibility date. In other words, you take the difference between when you donated and when you became eligible for the wheel, you see this peak right at 0 and to the right. So what this means is that donations tend to occur the same year or right after an individual becomes eligible for appointments. And you can see actually the year before there's like a decent amount, but this actually might be because of the fact that in Harris County, the judges who vote on appointments, the judges actually vote on who gets on the wheel. So it might make sense for you to actually give money the year before you actually get on the wheel because that might help you to get on the wheel in the first place, right? To the extent, so that's not really pay to play, that's pay to get on the wheel. So if you take this year -1, and I should have specified this x-axis is years, okay? And you go to the right, it's the vast majority of individuals are essentially paying their first donation right before or soon after they actually become eligible for appointments. And I think that's one of the stronger pieces of evidence that what's going on here is pay to play, okay? And so, and we can look at this in more detail with different regression analysis, right? If you donate in the last election, right, you're assigned on average about 22 more cases by a judge. This is another regression analysis. I'm gonna skip, so I'm gonna skip ahead. Basically, another thing is, one thing we talked about is, right, are these attorneys actually doing a better job for the criminal defendants, the donors? And the answer is no, not really, no. So, you know, we don't have time to go into the details here, but you can measure whether it's a good outcome, right? We define a good outcome if a case is dismissed, a defendant is acquitted, or charges are reduced, right? We can see whether the defendant ended up being sentenced to the Texas Department of Corrections or whether they served, you know, what their jail or prison term was, right? So donors this negative means they're less likely to attain a good outcome. They're more likely to have a client who ends up in the Texas Department of Corrections, and their clients are likely to have longer jail or prison terms. So there's no evidence. Bottom line is there's no evidence that these attorneys are doing better for their clients. If anything, there's evidence that they're doing worse, right? And we don't make a strong causal claim, right, in terms of saying that this means that they're necessarily doing worse. But we can make the simple statement that there's no evidence that they're doing better, okay? And so I think I'll skip through all of this a little bit, right? But these are sort of the policy suggestions which we've worked a little bit on in this article and we're gonna be focusing on in other articles, right? You know, a minimal thing which may seem to make sense is if you donate to a judge, you shouldn't be eligible for appointments from that judge, right? Part of the problem with that is that sometimes we see it happening in reverse. You get appointments from a judge and then you give donations, right? So, you know, how do you deal with that? You might want to have a managed assigned counsel system, but that's sometimes politically unpopular in your state. For example, George W. Bush vetoed an attempt to do that in the early 2000s. You could try to enforce workload limits for appointed counsel, but that's not really worked. And really our idea is the biggest problem with all these, none of these address the incentive gap, right? Defense attorneys still have incentives that are not aligned with their clients, all right? So we have some ideas. We have some ideas for contingent criminal defense, right? You measure the value added of attorney. I can talk about this in Q&A, but you know, there's new opportunities based on machine learning and better case data, and it's been done in other settings, healthcare and education, et cetera, where you might have a contingent criminal defense system where attorneys are paid based on kind of performance. But the bottom line I want you to take away from this is the incentive gap is a pervasive problem in indigent defense, and campaign finance is making this worse, right? As I pointed out, donors are basically getting twice as many cases as non-donors, and those cases are coming from their donee judges, not from others. And it holds regardless of whether you control for who these attorneys are, who these judges are, where they attended law school, the law school ranking, the years of practice experience, all of these things, the results hold the whole time. So it's none of that stuff that's driving the results here, okay? And so this is a problem in Harris County. We think it's a problem in Texas, and we're looking into whether this might even be a bigger problem across the United States. And so that's it.
That's really fantastic, Neil. I really, really found that stimulating. Thank you so much. By all means, keep your presentation up in case you need to refer back to it. But we've now got up to 32 people. We had a couple of people just join in the first few minutes you guys are speaking. I don't see any questions in chat, but I would invite, we don't usually have a group quite this big, but I'm going to take the risk. I would invite anybody who has a question, just simply unmute and go ahead and ask it, and we'll try and just, if people are talking over each other, we'll try and just take turns. Usually when I make this first announcement, there's now about a 15-second lull where everybody tries to be polite and wait for everybody else to speak. So I urge you just to go ahead and...
Andy, I won't be polite. This is Bob Berukowitz. I'm curious whether after this was reported in the Times, what the political reaction has been. Are judges responding? Is the bar responding? What's happening in Houston?
Yeah, so I think the timing of everything has muted some of the reaction. When the Times article ran, it was right around the time where a bunch of criminal justice stuff was coming up on Commissioner's Court due to the George Floyd stuff. But at least one commissioner has, I think even that day, that Commissioner's Court meeting following the publication of the article, Commissioner Ellis has proposed transitioning, expanding the public defender in Harris County at a little bit bigger clip. But honestly, there hasn't been as much, I think, reaction as there would have been if the George Floyd and the coronavirus stuff wasn't sort of eating a lot of the headlines. It's an issue that everybody talks about for sure, and I think Neil mentioned we're going to be continuing to sort of do some analysis in the state and elsewhere, and continue to sort of dig into this even in Harris County. But really to date, there hasn't been as much reaction as we thought. And that may be too, in part because the Harris County folks were moving in response to some of their indigent defense issues, Commissioner Ellis was also trying to move towards a managed assigned counsel system. And I don't know, that our article definitely helps highlight the problem, but it's we don't really take a position on what the best policy is to adopt as a result. And I think that's what the folks pushing the managed assigned counsel in Harris County would really like. But we're hoping to keep the discussion about it going because it really, we see this problem in Harris County for so long. And now we finally have something. It's funny, Neil and I had, in our research, come across, a handful of times where the Houston Chronicle or the Houston Press had written about, boy, it sure seems like these campaign donors are receiving a lot of appointments, but that was sort of where it was left. And where we were, we're hoping our study fits in is that we can now, throw some numbers and some evidentiary weight behind that connection between the donors and the appointments.
Yes, I think we're still hopeful that this is going to, I'm responding to some of your questions, and some of you have sent me questions in chat, but just go ahead and just state them for everyone so everyone can actually hear them too. But Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to keep publicizing this, and I think it will get attention. We have some more stuff that we're going to probably release this fall in one form or another, and so so I guess stay tuned. But yeah, if you can get the ear of some of these folks and try and get them to change, that would be most welcome.
I have a question from a purely sort of self-interested, using this in litigation kind of perspective. I do post-conviction work. And I've been trying to, since I saw your article, trying to think about how to deploy this information, for example, in ineffective assistance of counsel claims. One thing that just occurred to me during this presentation is that these judges are also now, sitting in a setting where there is like a ineffective assistance of counsel claim in post-conviction. They're sitting in judgment of the lawyers that they're appointing. And it seems to me that there's a real disincentive to find these lawyers ineffective if they're in fact funding their campaigns. But I've been, trying to think about, we often will look at caseloads and what it is lawyers are doing during their representations. But I've been, trying to measure the correlation between, you said that you can't really say necessarily that it's evidence that they're doing a poorer job, but whether there's more that can be done to show, thinking about deficient performance and so forth.
That's a great question. And it's something we are looking into, actually. So we're collecting comprehensive information on ineffective assistance claims. And so we will be able to tie that in and see if these folks are actually more likely to be found or less likely, as you suggest, ineffective. Now, of course, the ineffective assistance, right, at the trial court level, that's going to be tricky because an individual is probably not going to raise an ineffective assistance claim against himself, right? So the attorney has to be reassigned. So, on appeal, I think you're probably going to be more likely to see some of this stuff. So that's what we're looking at. And we're also looking at other behavior to see whether these donor attorneys might be just not taking it seriously, right? Not filing motions in limine, not seeking investigations. Things like that, sort of obvious stuff that you should be doing as a criminal defense attorney, not doing that. So we're looking into that in a detailed way and collecting data.
Please do keep them coming. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question.
Hi, this is Meg Ledyard. I actually work in Travis County. But I'm actually more interested in sort of the incentives and thinking about designing better payment systems. It's something that we've talked about a little bit in IDRA occasionally, but I think it's something that it would be worth sort of getting some people who, particularly economists who think about this stuff a lot, because there's really that fear when you start doing a lot of pay for performance that you're going to get something like what we did with the teachers, right? So are we measuring the right things is the first question we always ask ourselves. What can we measure? What should we be measuring? IDRA does a lot of that stuff. I think that's something we talk about all the time. So that's sort of the first challenge. What are you measuring? What is your performance? And then suppose that we could measure that, right? Or the things we're not measuring, are we then going to get, unintended consequences? That's the second question, right? So teachers, we started testing. We said, oh, we can test, but we can't measure all these other things we care about. We're going to pay for testing results. And then you see bad things happen and the world goes, oh, we didn't know that was happening. And all the economists go, we all knew this was going to happen. And so I think that's one of the fears or the unknowns that I think really could use some guidance. And I think it's an interesting area. So it was more of a comment, I guess. I don't have a question, but what do you have to say about that?
Thank you, Meg. And I totally agree with you that unintended consequences, whenever you have a new system or a new idea, unintended consequences you have to be worried about. So the teachers sort of value-based measures is a good example, right? When they started kind of trying to tie pay or sort of retention of teachers to how students performed, you incentivize them to, get their students cheating or to teach to the test and not teach the information. So yeah, we have some ideas on this. So with criminal defense, the idea would be, what's the outcome, like you suggested, what's the outcome? Well, ideally, outcome is contingent on the quality of the case. You end up with a shorter prison sentence, right? Or you end up with, less likely to actually end up in prison, right? So I think actually it's a little bit clearer in this context than it is in other contexts, what we want the outcome to be. Now, of course, how do you control for differences across cases? So an individual attorney might say, it's unfair that you punished me that my client got convicted. I just got a really bad case. I got a dog of a case. Defendant doesn't want to help. You're punishing me and you're not paying me or as much or at all for this. And that might be true. I think there are ways around that. First of all, it might be true in one particular case, but if individuals get a portfolio of cases, that's not going to be true as you increase the sort of sample number of cases that they get. And so in the aggregate, it shouldn't be that, attorneys are like super unlucky or super lucky in terms of the cases that they get if they are truly kind of randomly assigned.
I do like to point out that if we go with the wheels also, that's even more true. So the less bench appointing judges are doing, that the more truly random that stuff is. So I like to point that out when people talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Too. Yeah, I mean, counter argument to that is, but is random assignment really the best thing for criminal defendants? Maybe there's specialization that, right? So you could always come up with counter arguments. Maybe random assignment is not necessarily the best thing. Maybe you want people specializing, so you can always come up with, this stuff is very complicated. So I think that's I totally agree with you on that in terms of the wheel, in terms of randomization too. Other things you could do, right? I don't know how familiar you guys are with how machine learning works, but what machine learning essentially does is it takes kind of rich data and it allows you to make predictions, right? And we've seen that in the context of bail kind of being used and misused as to who should be bail eligible and stuff like that. But in this case, where it could actually be pretty useful is to kind of do quality control in terms of the type of cases that are assigned. If we had a contingent criminal defense system where these attorneys were being paid based on performance. So this is more of a theoretical idea. This is more of kind of a law review theoretical idea, but it hasn't really been discussed. And so one of our follow-up projects is looking at that as an idea. And obviously, I don't think that's the first best system. I think a first best system would be fully funding public defenders and really actually taking it seriously. But I'm not sure that's going to happen. And so the question is, what do you do if that doesn't happen? So these are just sort of ideas we're exploring. But we'd be happy to chat with you more about it if you're interested.
Yeah, and we can talk about maybe doing an IDRA brainstorming at some point later in the year too, if people will be up for that.
Sure.
Hello, my name's Minor Lopez. I'm a student at Seattle University School of Law, and I had a question about whether or not you plan to maybe connect this to voter suppression and or voter registration and how that impacts the elections and then the results that come from those elections.
I'm not sure there's a direct connection with voter suppression. I mean, I think it's indirectly connected in the sense that our election system is kind of messed up in a lot of ways. I mean, I think, I personally think the idea that there's partisan elected judges in Texas seems kind of crazy to me. I clerked in a federal court. I worked for a federal judge, and I was sort of struck by how independent they were, whether they're Republican or Democrat. They were independent in their own ways. They had their ideologies, but they're independent. I think that's kind of essential. So if you have elected judges to begin with, I think especially partisan elected judges, I think you're already kind of in trouble. then obviously there's all the voter suppression stuff and the voter ID stuff. I think this whole system is messed up. So in that sense, it's all connected. I don't think there's a direct connection that I can see, but if you could see one, I welcome you to tell us between the voter suppression stuff and what we observe here.
And it's an interesting question too, because we had y'all may have seen in Harris County, there was a bit of a wave election in 2018. And at that time there was, after I was talking about Beto O'Rourke, and I had a lot of reporters call me and say, is this because of Beto? Is this because he's driving turnout? And simultaneously also saying, these judges aren't really campaigning. I can't, and they actually one of the judges that won in 2018 didn't really have a campaign, and the judge defeated sort of made that seem like it was the judge that was defeated was more qualified because he was willing to campaign for the office. And I think if you ask the judge that won that race, I think he intentionally didn't campaign because of sort of this ickiness of the system. And I'll just echo what Neil said. It's just, and then this was what was so crazy at the beginning. It's just a very clear conflict of whether it's perceived or real when a judge is accepting donations and then giving an appointment back. And there's definitely I'm really interested in just like thinking about the judicial elections, just because the questions the reporters that I were getting were, so is this because of Beto? Is this because of the campaign ads? But I think the issue is we don't really know a lot about the elections besides the campaign donations, and unfortunately there's a lot of votes outside of those campaign donations too.
One thing I should add is that one thing I found interesting in the data is that this is not also just like a one party or one group issue. There's not a Republican thing. There's not a Democratic thing. It's not a gender or race thing. Like, so I sort of like to say is like, graft is an equal opportunity employer. And so you kind of see this across the board, which is in some ways, it's maybe in some ways even more troubling. It's just so institutionalized that it's just like, yeah, this is how we do business. Everyone does business. And I think I don't know, if we think if our work can kind of change, like just lay that out in the sunlight a little bit, and so people can see this, that would be something which, we'd be grateful for. So just people to be aware and be like, is this really what you want your criminal justice system to be like?
I'd be really curious if you could, when you're studying outcomes, compare the lawyers who don't donate to the ones who do. Because the question of, because when you said everyone does it, everyone doesn't do it, apparently. The people who don't do it don't get the business. It reminds me of when I went to law school in Chicago, and we literally voted in our clinic on whether we would bribe the clerks, because that was what was going on.
Yeah.
We decided not to, and we would always be called last. So I'm just curious whether you can sort by outcomes the people who don't give money.
Yeah, so let me show you. So, well, I'm from Chicago, so I hear you. Yeah, it's not great. I'd love to sort of take a look and see what's happening in my home state too. But so this, can you guys see this? This is exactly. I know I went through this quickly. This is doing exactly what you suggested here, comparing outcomes for donors versus non-donors. And so this donor somewhere is what we call a dummy variable. It's a 0-1 variable. If it's a 1, that means the individual attorney was a donor. If it's a 0, that means he or she was not. And so what this is saying is the good outcome, the probability of a good outcome goes down when this donor somewhere variable is triggered. So what does that mean? If you're a donor somewhere, right, you're less likely to attain a good outcome, right? You're about 1 percentage point less likely to attain a good outcome, okay? Your client is more likely, right, to be sentenced to the Texas Department of Corrections, and is more likely to receive a jail term. Okay. So I think that's hopefully answers your question about, and by the way, you see these things at the bottom, charge fixed effects, judge fixed effects, etc. These are ways of controlling for differences in cases. So you might be thinking, well, yeah, but the donors get really different cases than non-donors. Well, first of all, we sort of saw that that was not true when I showed you the summary statistics, but you can more formally control for that. So the charge fixed effects, for example, controls for differences in the types of cases that are charged. The judge fixed effects controls for differences in the judges themselves in the cases. And so hopefully, I think it was Robert, hopefully that answers your question.
Guys, I have to apologize. We are coming right up on the hour here. This hour has flown by. And if anybody has a really, really fast question, we might just have a few seconds for it. But I do not want to lose the opportunity to thank Jay and Neil very much for this presentation. I find this research immensely stimulating. I do a lot of work around the politics of public defense, and I will be citing this constantly, I can tell. So thank you so much to both of you. We do try to respect people's time, and so I feel awful cutting off the conversation at this moment, but this has been immensely enriching. I would love for us to stay in touch. Meg has already suggested that we have sessions continuing out of this. You've said you'll be publishing more, so we'll certainly be keeping tabs on it. I see people are writing their own thanks into the chat box as well. I wish we had all afternoon. Unfortunately, it's Friday and it's summer, so I'm delighted to let people go and have them play in the backyard instead. But thank you so much to both of you, and really, this was tremendously valuable, and we'll look forward to being in touch.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all.
Please feel free to circulate our email address and everything, and y'all please feel free to email me or Neil if you have any other questions.
Certainly will. Thank you. We'll take you up on that. Thank you both.
Have a good weekend.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Bye.